I know it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Eat, Pray, Run, where slow food in the apocalypse doesn't mean you're ending up on the menu. I hope you brought your appetites. I'm Dr. Erica O'Neill, researcher in the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics at Arizona State University. And today we're going to reaffirm our humanity in the zombie apocalypse through culture. Sourdough cultures, that is, with master bakers Michael Kalanty and Peter Reinhart. But first, I want to introduce the host of Eat, Pray, Run, Rob Dunn. Dr. Rob Dunn is a Reynolds Professor in the Department of Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University and a Professor of Human Biodiversity at the Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics at the University of Copenhagen. Rob, can you tell us a bit about the juicy topics we're going to sink our teeth into today?
We're going to sink our teeth into bread. I'm super excited about this show. We're going to talk about transforming grain into bread, how that works in a zombie apocalypse, how you bake when there's little around you. And I think we have concrete lessons you can take home today.
Fabulous. On that note, let's bring on our first guest. Michael Kalanty, author, teacher, and certified master taster from San Francisco. Michael, how many loaves of sourdough have you baked in quarantine?
Oh my gosh, Erica, it's not just me, because as you know, you discard some of your starter every day. And I started literally a baking community in my neighborhood, and I would put little Ziploc baggies of starter on the telephone pole outside, and we would have classes on Zoom. So lots of bread was baked.
So the zombie apocalypse has reduced you to offering up little mysterious bags on a street corner. Is this right?
That's right, because if you remember, there was a really very strict social distancing at the beginning. So I would have to use duct tape and put things up and make sure that they were, sufficiently far apart on the pole so people could drive by on their bikes and get them. It was really a community effort. It was great to observe.
Well, so I think that brings up my first question, which is how can bread baking sort of restore our humanity in a zombie apocalypse world? What does it offer to us? How does it transform us?
So that's a great question, and I think just looking back at the recent COVID and all of that stuff, it made me think of how adaptable we are as humans, and how we really can source and tap into that in order to, first of all, survive, but secondly, to continue to nurture and sustain ourselves. And making bread is really just one of those things. I have something here I want to share on the screen. So let's see if this screen will let me do that. And
I'm ready. I'm ready for it to be a mysterious bag, like that. This is the virtual post of a sourdough.
Oh, okay. No, actually, I with the help of Neil Smith, who did all the illustrations, I came up with this graphic. Can you see it? Is it up on the screen?
We don't see it yet, but maybe you can walk us through the idea as it's emerging.
Oh gosh, okay. So it's the whole idea of Maslow's triangle, with safety and security at the bottom, and then food and shelter, and these needs that we have as humans, and at the top, self-actualization. And being forced into a situation where you need to be resourceful, really, you have to embrace it, provide yourself that shelter that you need, and then baking bread, of course, will give you the sustenance, but it's an excellent way of tapping into your own resourcefulness as a human being. So it really is, bread baking is a form of self-actualization.
Well, and I love the way in which your the community building that you did and leaving those sourdough starters out connected you to other people that you might not ever see in person, but also connected you through those microbes, because you were sharing microbes that were near and dear to you with them, even in this unusual time. And so the community component of making your way in the world, I think, is really interesting and important.
Well,
Oh, and
I have to,
here we have your image too, Michael.
oh, that's great. That's great. So, okay, so here's Running Man, right? And then, your various levels of security and humanity, whether you're being chased by zombies or not. And as you go through the shelter and community, and that was you were talking about sharing, you see how bread actually brings all of these together and helps you form a sense of community and be able to share everything with everybody, especially microbes.
Well, so that makes me think, about a world with bread and a world without bread. And can you talk a little bit about how the world changed once bread was first baked? Were there new aromas? Was there a new dimension added to what we experienced?
Oh, absolutely. And I have here a bread that I baked specifically for for us today. And
wait, does that say ZA? Right, is that a zombie apocalypse bread?
It does,
oh,
Rob.
Amazing.
I made it just for you. And now, of course, this is not what Neanderthal man ended up baking. This is the result of centuries of development and research by bakers. But I just want to come back here and show you what that looks like for a second. And as we cut through this,
hungry.
I want you to see that the crust, of course, is very, very dark from the heat, and that is part of what we call the Maillard reaction. So here's the reveal, and let's see what we have. Oh yes, okay. So the idea with the Maillard reaction is that sugars in the dough caramelize at different temperatures, and as they do, they link up with different proteins, amino acids, different enzymes in any sort of permutation. And they start to color and flavor and to aromatize the surface. So every loaf of bread from every location is going to have a different character. So I think it's very important, especially during these times. I mean, it's, that's what I think initially went on, but I'm going to take a second here and just show. I made a aroma chart for bread flavors to help my students be able to identify what different flavors are in the crumb or in the crust, etc. And I especially think during a sequestered environment, it's tasting and eating, that's something that is intrinsic to us. And the better that we can learn to make our vocabulary and discuss on those terms, the stronger and the more lasting these terms will be. Because if we don't, they could just go away with the apocalypse.
No, that's great. And to me, it really unites baking and the appreciation of baking with art, because in the same way that understanding art offers one more in terms of appreciation of that art, I think coming to appreciate the aromas in bread, what they represent, offers it a greater appreciation of the bread. So we'll also post your guide online at the end of this show so people can use and see it.
Well, that's great. That's great. I was just making a point, but my editors will love that. So thank you.
Perfect. I know very well that even in a zombie apocalypse, you have to think about editors.
Well, yes, they remind you. Yes.
But I do think, I mean, do you think of your, Erica's here. Hey, Erica.
So I wanted to open up the discussion. We have one more master baker with us today. I wanted to bring him into the stream too, to chat a bit with you, Rob, and then bring you all together to sort of discuss sourdough baking and apocalyptic conditions and kind of how you can adapt to that.
Fantastic.
So I'm going to introduce our next guest that we have. This guest is Peter Reinhart, Executive Director of the Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Were you the one who bought up all the yeast in the stores prior to the shelter-in-place order?
I wish actually I was sitting pretty. You don't really need yeast if you have yeast at home, and most people turn to sourdough, natural fermentation, because you're not dependent on commercial yeast, and probably get a better loaf as well.
Peter, I've heard you talk a lot about the transformation of bread. Can you talk about what that means and how you think about transformation? I mean, thinking about zombies, transformation is very much on our mind. Where does bread fit in this story?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what Michael was saying earlier about the sort of journey to self-actualization as well. I think of bread both, sort of literally and also symbolically and metaphorically as the perfect symbol of transformation. I call it a transformational food. And the reason I call it a transformational food is because if you think of a transformation as being a radical change of something into something else, which is, again, a little bit of zombification already, the bread really epitomizes that. More than any other aspect of cooking, bread making goes through a series of transformations, because cooking itself is transformational. You're taking ingredients, turning them into something edible, usually through the application of heat, which, by the way, heat was a critical component of this question you asked Michael earlier about the releases of aromas, and because once you applied fire to ingredients, everything changed. And that made transformation possible. He talked about caramelization and Maillard reactions. You need heat for that to occur. But bread goes through an interesting level of I would say 3 to 4 major transformations. The first one being wheat is alive. We harvest it, we kill it, we take the life away from it. So in the process of making a loaf of bread, you first have to kill the wheat, and then you turn that flour, which is basically the clay of the earth, mix it with water, salt, and leaven. And that leaven could be yeast, or it could be commercial. It could be natural leavening, and you bring it back to life. So first transformation is alive to dead. Second transformation is dead brought back to life. And this is really where it starts to become interesting for us as we enter into this era, this apocalyptic zombie era, is that we are participating in a transformational process that parallels quite a bit, and again, how deep you want to get into it metaphorically depends on your frames of reference. But we're basically replicating the Genesis story, because you're bringing something back to life. You're cultivating it as the creator of this new life form. You're watching over it. You're kind of making choices that help to shape it, but you're letting it have its own life. You're giving it free will to grow into what it can become. And then in order for it to complete its journey, the leaven, whose purpose was to raise the dough so that it could become bread, the leaven has to go into the oven with everything else, and it has to give up its life. At 138 degrees, any kind of living organisms will die. So the leaven sacrifices its own life for the sake of the loaf. So what went into the oven is dough, but what comes out of the oven is bread. So yet another transformation, alive back to dead, but becomes dough into bread. And so all these various flows of transformation are happening as a result of fermentation, ultimately, and the acting of heat and biological processes to change flour, wheat growing in the field, into something totally different, something that has become a powerful symbol in all cultures and religions, and it's intrinsic to our life. It's the staff of life. So I think there's a lot of levels that bread works on, and it's why it is ultimately such a nurturing, not just a nurturing food, a nurturing concept.
So how do you think about yourself as a baker in this context? Are you an artist? Are you a creator? Are you what is your role in this story?
Well, a lot of people use different terms and metaphors again to describe it. I consider it, the way I describe it, at least, or articulate it, is that we get to participate in this transformational journey. So I think we're co-creators. We're co-creators with nature and with the forces that kind of set it all up in the first place, and we get to step into that role of being a creator. And we're not making the transformation happen. We're kind of overseeing the transformation. We're allowing it to happen on our watch.
I love that. Yeah, and I love the sense in which, I often think about collaborating with the starter, but you're really talking about collaborating with the starter, collaborating with the grain, collaborating with fire, collaborating with all of nature from your kitchen. It's really a beautiful sentiment, Peter. I love it.
But I love it too because it works on so many levels, and everything does. Everything works on many levels. But with bread, it's very transparent. You can actually peel back those levels and dig into it and appreciate it on all of those levels. And then you end up with something, as beautiful as this, which is not a real loaf of bread. It's a pillow. It's a pillow, but it's modeled on the famous loaves of the Poilâne Bakery in Paris. This is what their 4-pound loaves look like that are kind of legendary. Or you can get something as simple as this, which is just a sandwich loaf. This again is not a real loaf of bread. It's a foam sponge. I got it as a speaker at a conference to give everybody a little foam loaf. But anyway, it works again metaphorically. These aren't real breads, but they are breads.
So can you talk a little bit about the difference between sort of commercial yeast and a sourdough starter, and how this relates to the transformation, and how do you feel about them? Do you feel bad when you're working with a commercial starter and good when you're working with sourdough, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I don't feel bad because it's all transformational. We're just taking something that works faster. And with commercial yeast, it's much more concentrated. It's kind of been cultivated in a hothouse. So a teaspoon of instant yeast has way more living yeast cells than a teaspoon of natural starter, which has a lot of flour and water, and the living organisms are spread out a lot more. So the processes are different and slower. And I think that's one of the reasons why sourdough bread ultimately does yield a better product, because slow is good in this regard. Fast can get you the products and can feed people, but if the transformations happen too quickly, some of the other things that you trade off, such as digestibility or flavor release, nuance, the aroma that Michael was talking about, and again, you can make it all happen in about 4 hours. You could have a loaf of bread from start to finish, but if you give it a longer time by either using colder temperatures to ferment it, or a more natural starter that's not as concentrated, then other transformations take place in the dough itself, because enzymes enter into the picture, and enzymes have the capability of breaking apart the molecules of the starch and the proteins and the sugars and making them more digestible and releasing, again, more flavor. And just this one thing I thought of when Michael was talking about aroma was a friend of mine, and Michael and I work sometimes on projects for a company where we develop prototypes for big companies. And we were working on one. We were each creating prototypes for something, and my friend presented to the client a beautiful baked item, and they said, "Well, what would happen if you increased the temperature and baked it at 450 instead of at 400 degrees? What would it do to the product?" And he came up with this phrase that I've never forgotten. It's like 20 years ago. He said, "Well, you would probably volatilize the aromaticity." And everybody went, "Oh, yeah." And afterwards, when we walked out, I said, "Where did you come up with that one?" And he said, "I made it up on the spot." But they love hearing stuff like that. But it's true. It's true.
That's fantastic. Let's bring Michael back into the room too, so we can all talk. And I'm going to start you guys off with a question that's come up several times in the comments here. And it's one that people are really interested. So in the early days of the apocalypse, they couldn't find flour or butter because everyone tried to make bread and it wasn't available in the stores. There was a flour shortage. So what do you do when there's no flour, no quick yeast? How do you make sure that you're still cultivating these sorts of bread cultures and sort of the cultures that tie us together through eating this way?
You want to go for it first, Mike?
Jump in, and then I'll give my side of it.
Okay, all right, then I'll start. So first of all, we already mentioned that by keeping a starter, you're not dependent on yeast, but yeast is back. There's plenty of yeast out there. They just were caught off guard, the yeast companies, and they ran out of stock. But everyone regrouped. The same with the flour companies. The flour, disappeared, but it's back. But the fact is that it could happen again, and if we get another wave of COVID or something, the shelves could get decimated. So what do you do? What other things can you make bread from? You can make bread from any product. Wheat is just so great because it has a lot of gluten, and gluten, of course, gives you bread more aeration. It allows it to trap carbon dioxide. But the gluten-free movement has proven that you can make bread from lots of other grains, rice flour. But think back to cultures that were not wheat-based. So you have something like cassava. Breads made from cassava flour there's probably as many flatbreads made from cassava flour as there are leavened breads made from wheat flour in the world. but mostly in the equatorial realms where those things grow, or a taro root in Hawaii to make poi. Those are all just variations of bread. So, and of course, we knew that there was an old saying that acorns were great until God invented wheat, or something like that. It's where acorns work too, but they just weren't as effective because they didn't have gluten. When gluten entered the picture, the whole nature of bread
Which is to say, some of these collaborations are easier than others, right? Yeah,
yeah, and the results are different. So, but it's all good food. It's all ingredients that have been transformed into something nourishing and edible and delicious.
So from my point of view, to answer that question, because forewarned is forearmed, stock your kitchen or wherever your dries with some grains, any kind of grains. This is farro, which is one of the original ancient grains, and get yourself some sort of like mashing tool or something like that, because on the surface of all of these grains, show the grains, Mike, is yeast. Wild yeast is on the surface of this. So it's waiting. It's almost like just add water. Just smash them, put them in water, and it will become its own bread. Now, it's not going to be as smooth and elegant as the things we're used to buying at our artisan bakeries, but it will still be a form of bread. And in that adaptability, our aesthetic will change of what we want. I mean, there you go.
Can I add something to that, Michael? There's two tools that you might have already. Most people might have already, as long as we have electricity. One is something like that we call a mock mill. A mock mill is a little attachment that you can put onto your KitchenAid that is a stone mill. There it is. There's another mock. There's a version of the mock mill.
You can get a tabletop model and use that as great styling when you have to do cooking demos. And the grain goes in here and it comes out here, and I do it and I grind fresh grain right into my starter. So my starter gets a fresh, hearty breakfast every day.
And I feel like we just segued into the home shopping channel. For only $27.99, this mock mill can be yours and save you from the apocalypse.
I have one that hooks right into my KitchenAid. Well, like a little attachment on the top, and it can do the same thing. And I also have one of those blenders, a Vitamix, and the Vitamix can break down grains into flour also. And so again, they're great tools as long as we got electricity. Now, when electricity's out, then go to the mortar and pestle.
I think the broader lesson here is that you go to Peter or Michael's house, you form a quarantine pod, and you eat well.
That's right.
I've got a related question, which is a colleague of mine discovered the oldest bread in the world, 14,000 years old in Jordan.
Oh, I know.
And she doesn't. This is a Maya Aranzota guy, and she doesn't know a ton about it. She just found little pieces of it, but it's made from some kind of wheat, and then the roots of something like a bulrush. And so the roots gave it a lot. They were easier to find, easier to gather. And so they would have been ground together and somehow baked. But archaeologists don't know how it was made. And so if you were given these ingredients, what would you do? What kind of bread would you make? What would your...
Okay,
probably
Peter, I'm going to go first, Peter.
Okay, all right, you got it. All right,
that's okay.
He's got an answer.
Right.
I'm going to let him have it.
We're both from Philly, so that's it's okay.
If it's a cheesesteak, this is we're off the rails.
That's what I would do with it. Yeah.
All right. So the sedge and those reeds and all that kind of stuff. That's like a hamburger helper. That's like an extender, right? And in a way, that forms the role of the starches in the bread. So you can make a kind of a slurry-ish kind of mud pie from that, and then within that structure, suspend the grains of whatever it is that you have: the cassava, the taro, the ancient grain, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I would approach it. So if you want to send me some, I'll take it apart, man. Peter and I will collaborate on it. We'll figure out.
But I think the first thing that would probably happen before it would turn into bread, we have to assume that there was fire or something that could transform the starches to gelatinize the starches and to caramelize the sugars. So assuming that there's fire, you could do that. But let's say you didn't have fire, what could you do with it? You would probably do what the ancients did, was they made beer. Because really, beer is just liquid bread when you think about it. Liquid bread without the heat, component. And so, as far as when people debate over which came first, beer or bread, I tend to come down on the beer side first. With my theory being that whoever was making the beer fell asleep in the hot Egyptian sun, and somehow his beer got baked by the sun, and it got solid. And he went, "Whoa, we got something new here, and let's call it bread." But really, they're variations on a theme. And ultimately, the thing that ties them all together is the notion of fermentation, which I think is really the active agent in this transformational process.
And I think a really beautiful thing about this, too, is that it's long been debated what came first, agriculture, beer, or bread. And it's now clear that both bread and beer predate agriculture. And so in a time before we figured out how to farm, we're already transforming and making these things.
Drinking. Right, exactly.
Yeah. And so it's a beautiful sort of feature of our past, but also sets us up for zombie apocalypse time. We might not have farms. We might not be able to rely on agriculture, but we can still gather, still make bread, still have some beer. It doesn't sound so bad when you put it like that.
So there is a question related to that in the comments right now. It's from Athena Actipus, and she is curious if you are going to do that, if you're going to be foraging for those grains. Do you have any tips on that? Have you guys ever done wild foraging yourselves? Wow. Can you channel maybe your evolutionary ancestors who have?
Go to Kansas. Yeah. Wow. No,
I think I would go to seeds first. Seeds, any kind of seed is a grain is a type of seed, but any kind of seed can be turned into a flour, and any kind of flour can be turned into a food product. So I would go for wherever you can find seeds, whether it's sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, poppy seeds, you name it, and grind them down. Make a slurry, as Michael said. One of the ways that I've been doing a lot of gluten-free doughs, like pizza doughs, for instance, gluten-free, is since they don't hold together without the gluten, they don't really, create a risable loaf. I make a slurry instead and bake it like a pancake over, in a hot pan, and it sets everything. It caramelizes the sugars, it gelatinizes the starches, it coagulates the proteins. So those literal transformations are taking place. But then you get this flat product that's solid, that can be used as a wrap, or it can be used as a platform for a pizza, or it can be used as just a naan bread. And so you can do that with anything. You can do that with all these seeds. So I would just say, find the seeds that are growing near you.
Nuts also. And and that's become a big source of gluten-free products like almond flour and walnut flour and things like that. And it's the same thing. It's starches and proteins. You gelatinize them and then you heat them in some way in the Egyptian sun or on a flat top or in your oven, and you have a bread product. So.
Are you the reincarnation of that guy in Egypt who fell asleep in the pyramids and turned his beer into bread?
Rick Van, what would his name be? Rick Van Akhenaten.
I think another interesting possibility.
Yeah, that's his name.
Is that in Northern Europe, it used to be very common in the winter to forage for grains that rodents had stored. And so you would know where the rodents were. You would go and get their stored grains. And so you would have this diversity of stored grains that you could ferment, you could make bread, you could eat them as they were. And so I think there are a lot of places to look.
Talk about turning the tables on the rats.
The food chain in action, man.
So I'm going to end it on one more question for you guys. It's also from Athena, and it kind of goes with our theme. She wants to know if bread is kind of undead. In the way that you were describing it, Peter, it went back and forth between the different ways and levels and sort of transformations.
Once you bake it, it's dead. That's it.
Sort of, except that again.
Okay, all right.
On these multi-levels of things, right? Yes, we are baking a living dough and turning it into bread that is no longer alive. But think about it transformationally at this next level down, the metaphorical, or mystical levels. You're taking essentially a caterpillar going into the oven and a butterfly coming out. So it may not be alive, in terms of being a living organism, but it may be alive in terms of how it's affecting us, how it's impacting us at the aesthetic level. So instead of eating a caterpillar, you're eating a butterfly.
And then once you eat it, then that starts the whole process all over again. So
Wonderful.
Inside of us,
it's dead and undead at the same time.
On that note,
Right?
I think we have to wrap it up for today, guys.
Schrodinger's spread.
How
alive
better
and dead.
can you say the zombie apocalypse except that it's alive, it's dead, and it's undead at the same time?
Thank you,
Perfect.
guys.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Rob, Erica, Peter. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
It was wonderful to have all of you with us today. Thank you so much, everyone who tuned in and left comments. Remember that if you're registered for ZAM 2020, you can head over to the interactive workshops that will be happening between 11 and noon. And just to kind of shout out to both of our guests today, they're both wonderful published authors. So if you'd like to pick up Michael Kalanty's book on how to bake bread and even more, or if you are interested in Peter Reinhart's kind of compendium of bread and baking, we encourage you to do so. Until next time, eat well.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.